For Valentine's Day this year, I've made this cute little threaded lidded box for Natalie, my wife. Inside that, a Blackwood and titanium ring. And yes, I did actually make this in time for Valentine's Day, just the video I didn't finish because Natalie acts as my editor. She checks over all my mistakes for videos, so it's very hard to do that in secret while keeping the present a secret, getting her approval for everything. The fence is set up with set-up gauges rather than with measuring, as it's a hair easier and I had a new toy to play with. Rings need such a small amount of material, resawing brings it down to a close approximate. For thicknessing, pretty short, pretty thin material, it's not really something you can do at the thicknesser or, in this case, even the drum sander. It's just too short to go through safely. Hand playing jig like this is actually pretty useful and doesn't take a lot of work. So this is a really simple jig I've had for a couple of years, so I'm not going to remake it for this video. It is pretty simple. We've got 3 pieces of MDF, the base piece, and these 2 fences. These 2 fences have a small rebate in it, just enough to capture my hand plane. This is a low angle jack, but it'll also work with my number 4 from the same company. The key is that these are basically just spaced far enough apart that it clears the blade. So the rebates really just need to be whatever this thickness is, minus a little bit, just to give you a bit of room, so keeping away from the blade. This way the hand plane itself is independent of the workpiece, so I can slide that back and forth, and when it sits flat, it's at that exact thickness. There's a couple of ways you can adjust the thickness. One is to adjust the blade so it protrudes down further. The other way is to shim up this base piece here. There's a piece of scrap wood I've got in here, and if I put shims underneath it, raises that up, raises the workpiece up so it'll get thinner. It's also a small stop here so that when you're planing forward, the workpiece can't go anywhere, and that's all there is really to it. It's just worth noting, it's a nice little jig to have from time to time if you work on small stuff. After the correct thickness of 4.6mm is achieved, it's cross-cut to a smaller blank. If you're new here, you may be surprised to find that I actually have a lathe. And if you're not new here, you may be surprised that I still have a lathe and I haven't sold it. Probably haven't used a lathe for 3 years now, so don't pay too much attention to my technique. Something that I used to do a reasonable amount of, though it was more my wife's machine. Natalie suffered some back injuries, which means that using a lathe isn't super great for her, and I found that it just wasn't all that fun. Eventually I've figured out that the cutting action, the transfer of vibration seems to rattle my brain, or my migraines in particular, so I found that it's just not an enjoyable experience. Though in some cases like this, it is impossible to avoid the utility of a lathe. So for now we still have a lathe so I can make those things round. The blank is stuck onto a waste block on the lathe using double-sided tape. A 16mm Forstner bit is the closest I had to the correct size that didn't overshoot the size I needed. That gets rid of the majority of the waste, but you'll still need to go back with a turning tool to remove the rest to fit exactly over the steel core. This process is best done slowly, taking off small amounts, checking with calipers, then taking a little bit more off. While you can overshoot slightly, any more than about 0.3 of a millimetre won't work. With the blank sized and pried off the carpet tag, it can be glued onto the ring core. You can see how this particular core works. It's 2 pieces that clip together, allowing you to sandwich wood in between them. Cyanoacrylate or CA glue is applied to the inside of the ring blank, then the 2 ring core halves are placed inside that. A piece of paper towel dampened with some acetone will quickly clean off any squeeze out onto the ring itself. If you've not seen one of these before, this is an ER32 collet chuck. It's made up of several parts. We've got the adapter on the end here that goes to my lathe's thread, the collet chuck, the collet nut, and the collet itself. The collet is interchangeable and it's a standard, so it can use any brand's ER32 collets and they'll fit in here. 32 refers to the diameter of the collet. They have different clamping ranges and all of them are about 1mm clamping range. So this particular one goes from 13 to 12mm, so perfect for a 1/2-inch shank. I prefer this for holding small metal straight circular round shanks and stuff like that, whereas a 4-jaw scroll chuck, if we look at the jaws of it, they have that dovetail there. So they're not quite as good or not quite as well suited for holding metal objects, I feel anyway. This particular stepped expanding mandrel fits sizes 6 to 7. It's designed for wider rings, so that's why it doesn't have as many steps as other mandrels. As the bolt at the end is tightened, it expands the mandrel out, locking the ring into place. To turn the blank down, use a very gentle touch with the lathe spinning fast. While it is secure and it is reinforced with the steel core, it's still fairly fragile if you're not careful. When it's just a hair proud of the core, switch to sandpaper to finish the shaping, then work through the grits. Rings are supposed to be shiny, so take it all the way up to at least 600 grit. Then 10 to 15 coats of thin CA glue creates a waterproof finish that can take a high shine. A drop of 2 on the ring or on a piece of paper towel, then switch the lathe on to a low RPM and work it into the surface. Let that dry and rinse and repeat. Don't use cotton rags or paper towel reinforced with cotton, as it will cause an exothermic reaction with the CA and start smoking. After sufficient coats are built up, wet sanding with micromesh is the best way to buff anything on the lathe. Micromesh has their own grit system, but it's simply a process of working through the colour-coded soft pads with a drop or 2 of water on them. Afterwards, for a final bit of shine, Brasso can be applied, left to haze over, then burnished into the surface. This needs a little bit more pressure than the micromesh pads, but not too much. The box is sliced into 3 sections, the lid, the base and the body. This will make more sense later. The body gets a 35mm hole drilled through it. This 35mm hole is then tapped with a 1.5-inch tap. Metho or denatured alcohol is applied to the hole first, as this tends to make the end grain sections easier to cut, and the general result is a cleaner thread. This is why the bottom was cut off, so that the tap could go all the way through. I want to talk a little bit about the threading in this box. Has a 1.5-inch dowel that has been threaded on one side and a matching 1.5-inch ball with this enormous tap that went on in the box body itself. I've shown the threading stuff that I've used in the past. I'm not going to go into great detail at the moment for this project, but I have a few upcoming projects that will be using a bunch of threading stuff. So 2 components to it. First is actually making the dowel. I've had this on hand for a couple of years now, so I didn't actually use the jig to make this dowel. I just cut some of it off and then glued it into the lid. The way that you make this thread, or the way that I make this thread, is using a jig from the company called Beal. the Beal Tool Company. This has I don't know if it's nylon, HDPE or whatever, bushing in it. It's a 1.5 inch or 38mm bore on the input side, and on the output side there is the threading that matches up to it. In the middle you put a router with the appropriate bit. It's just a pointed, I think it's like a 60-degree bit perhaps, that cuts the matching threads for all the bits and pieces. So as you turn the dowel through, it cuts the thread, then it latches onto the threading in the bushing, and you keep advancing. It's pretty much the power tool equivalent of the wood threading boxes. Works pretty well. The advantage with this is you don't necessarily have to have as pliable material. Some woods will thread really well with the old school thread boxes, and those thread boxes can be really hit and miss these days with the quality of the cutter, particularly if you get the cheaper end of the scale. The lid receives a smaller hole for the matching threaded dowel, but the spur of the Forstner bit is too long for this thickness material and will result in a small hole being poked through. To hide that hole, the lid is sanded, then liquid glue and the sanding dust form a paste to plug the hole. Once that's all dried, it can be sanded back again and it becomes fairly invisible. Some off-camera experimentation with the threading position let me figure out what position the thread needed to be in for the box to close in the correct orientation. That's what the little pencil mark on both the lid and underside and the thread represent. Those two lines need to line up. The box body and base were also glued up. With everything cured, the lid was screwed onto the box, then it was all trimmed at the same time at the bandsaw to make it more ringbox sized rather than weird monstrosity. A little bit of cleanup with the shooting board and the box was ready for an oil wax finish. We don't normally do Valentine stuff, it just hasn't been part of our relationship. So Nat was quite thrilled and surprised, and I had to wrestle the ring off her to be able to shoot this conclusion. It's been on her pretty much ever since. That's been really nice. It's a fun little project, even though I'm not a huge fan of the lathe, it was a fun little project that didn't involve too much turning for me. The CA finish is holding up quite well, even though it's gone through a few dishwashing cycles as she's washed dishes in the kitchen sink and then thought, oh wait, there's a ring on my finger. The titanium is super light, so if you are looking for a super light ring, that's definitely a good option. The stainless steel will weigh, I think it's 60% more, something like that. Not that rings are a super heavy thing anyway. There's just a slight detour away from the big box Bonanza. I'm still working on that, and since there was such a great response to the flocking tests and how to apply flocking will be up next. I've got this lovely charcoal in, which has been a lot of fun to play with, so that'll be in the next video. Thanks for watching.